And as we are constantly talking about the need to engage students around climate action and sustainability issues, I believe this webinar today reflects a need of the whole higher education sector and certainly covers a highly relevant topic. Now, regarding the project, the Climate U is a partnership between universities in 9 countries: Brazil, Fiji, Kenya, Mozambique, Jamaica, Morocco, India, Tanzania, and the UK. The project has been running for 3 years now, since the beginning of 2020, and it is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. The aim of the project is to enhance the contributions of universities to addressing climate change and also bring benefit to communities of the participating countries. It involves the understanding of the impacts, responses, and contributions of these higher education institutions to the challenge of climate change. The 2 main approaches pursued by the project are the implementation of interventions at the participating universities by means of participatory action research for climate justice, aiming at strengthening these institutions and the higher education system as a whole in all dimensions: education, knowledge production, and campus operations, for example. And second, Climate U also generates a deeper understanding around these topics involving literature and building theory. In this webinar today, the 10th working paper of the project will be presented and discussed. It covers the results of a large-scale survey conducted among Climate U partner universities and focuses on students' views on climate change. Our presenter is author of the working paper, Kane Rolleston. Kane is a co-investigator in the project Climate U and professor in Education and International Development at University College London Institute of Education. He has worked on education and international development in a range of countries, including Ghana, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Peru, India, and Sri Lanka, and was formerly Senior Education Associate for the Young Lives Comparative International Study of Childhood Poverty, based at the University of Oxford. His research interests include issues in the economics of education in developing countries, educational access and equity, learning metrics, and survey design. And as discussed, we have the pleasure to count on Dr. Elsa Holloway, who is the postgraduate program coordinator for public health at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. She teaches and supervises students through the university's Disaster Risk Management and Development program. Dr. Holloway brings more than 25 years of university experience, primarily in South Africa, including the establishment of the Disaster Mitigation for Sustainable Livelihoods program and the Peri U, an initiative that introduced, then scaled, disaster risk scholarship in Africa. She is also a member of the advisory board of the project Climate U. Regarding the structure of our webinar today, we will have around 20 minutes for Kane's presentation and then 10 minutes for the response from Dr. Elsa, following by discussions among all of us. So please feel free to put your comments, insights, and questions into the chat. I will now hand over to Kane so that we can learn more about the key findings of the Climate U survey. Kane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Do let me know as I go if there are any technical issues. Hopefully the screen is shared now and everything is clear.
Yes. Yes.
So this presentation really reflects a couple of years of work, a lot of effort on the part of a number of people across the countries in this project, collecting a huge amount of data from universities, focused on students' views about what their universities are doing and what they should be doing. Hence the title, Stepping Up or Falling Behind, because there's a huge range of activities that students find their universities are doing and about their evaluations of the quality of that work. This is work actually that I have done together with Sarah Malik, who has put together some of the graphs and the data analysis, which I will now present. So as I said, the survey is designed really to focus on students' experience and their attitudes and engagement with what their universities are doing on environmental issues, not specifically only climate change, because we wanted to understand the full range of students' understandings of their universities' approaches to the environment. We collected data in 12 universities in 4 countries, which are mentioned as Brazil, Fiji, Kenya, and Mozambique. And the aim of the project has already been stated by Amanda, but the purpose of this survey was to respond to that aim, so to generate insights on how to maximize the contribution of universities in terms of their mitigation and adaptation challenges to climate change, and to understand more broadly how universities can or are contribute to climate justice. So I won't read all the list of universities, but here are the 12 universities in the 4 countries. The sample achieved in the different countries did differ somewhat, even though it was intended to be approximately the same. So Brazil achieved the highest, Kenya achieved the highest sample, followed by Brazil, more than 2,000 students in those 2 countries, with just less than 2,000 in Fiji and 737 students in Mozambique, where there were quite a few more logistical challenges of collecting data. So then to go into the details of the sample across the 4 countries, as I said, there are 12 universities, and there is not an intention to sample equally across all of the disciplines in these universities. So obviously the universities have different foci in terms of what they're teaching. Some specialize much more in sciences, some specialize much more in arts and humanities. So this sample is not expected to be equivalent across the countries. Nonetheless, we can see there's a reasonable balance of subjects in Brazil and Mozambique, whereas in Kenya, we have a large sample from the education faculties, and in Fiji, a larger sample from social sciences, business, and law. So this may, of course, affect the ways in which students evaluate their university's contributions or their university's approaches to the environment, because we might expect that some universities focused particularly on environmental or scientific issues would have different approaches. That's why later on I'll report the results of some regression analyses in which we try also to control for the students' courses of study. So in terms of the measurement, the things that we are effectively trying to measure in this survey, we need, first of all, to get a strong sense of the level of environmental concern that students have, because we believe that that is going to be behind many of their other attitudes and the ways that they evaluate their universities. So that's our first measurement construct, environmental concern. We also need to understand where students gain their information from, and this differs slightly across the country. So where is it that they know about climate change? Where is it that they gain their understandings of climate justice from? Is it from the media only? Is it from their universities only? Is it a combination? So these 2 factors we think will be partly determining some of their students' attitudes, and indeed they're also their willingness to participate, their willingness to act, and their behavior in relation to climate change. For example, are they willing to join volunteering activities? Are they willing to take independent action in relation to climate change? It will also determine what they believe their university should be doing. And of course, this normative attitude is partly dependent on what they are experienced in terms of what they have experienced in terms of what universities actually are doing. But in another sense, it's also independent, because globally, there is a huge amount of attention in the media to questions of climate change and climate justice, which will be forming attitudes among students apart from their universities. Then we come to questions of personal responsibility, which of course will be partly shaped by students' attitudes and experiences, but the questions there relate to the extent to which students feel that it is their individual responsibility and their collective responsibilities to address issues of climate change. And then finally, their views on the causes, impacts, and challenges of climate change. And these are important, and we could call this a kind of broad area which is related to climate skepticism. So to what extent do students believe humans are behind climate change and humans can therefore prevent it or mitigate it? One of the things that we're not assessing is students' actual knowledge of climate change, because clearly that would be very complex and time-consuming and would be quite expensive and controversial as well, because designing a knowledge assessment on climate change across 4 countries with such a large number of students would be extremely difficult. So we're not doing that. We're also not collecting any kinds of information or questions specifically relating to what students know about climate change in their own countries or globally. But we are collecting information about their courses of study, which would give us some indications of what they're learning, of course, and on their home backgrounds, which are important for controlling for their levels of advantage and disadvantage, which may be strongly related to their attitudes about climate change in some cases. And that includes their home assets. So we ask students a series of questions about possessions that they have in their family home. Okay, so first on to the question of sources of information. So where do students learn about climate change? What are their sources of information, their go-to sources? And we have pretty much actually a very similar pattern across the countries, although it's slightly more extreme in Brazil, where students answered that the media, TV, newspapers and radio, plus the internet and social media were almost exclusively the sources of information, plus from their friends and their own university coming forth. A similar pattern actually in the other countries, although the university comes 3rd in Mozambique and close to 3rd in Fiji, joint with friends, but nonetheless, in all of the countries, and I suspect elsewhere in the UK or in other countries, the power of the internet and social media, plus the traditional media in informing people about climate change is pretty difficult for universities to compete with. Then we asked students about what they believe are the causes, impacts, and challenges. As I mentioned, this is an important construct to see where students are coming from in terms of their level of understanding and their level of skepticism in relation to climate change. So there were some significant differences across the countries here, with Brazil, students in Brazil most likely to see climate change as caused by human activity, and in Kenya the least. But it turns out some of these things may be a little bit ambiguous or may need interpretation in the light of the context, because students who are more concerned, more worried about climate change perhaps are more likely to say that it's caused by human activity, but this may also be a response to how they feel climate change is being dealt with in their country. So these are certain endogeneity between these kinds of questions, which we will mention later. So then the question about how bad the impact of climate change will be, again, this will reflect students' understanding of climate change, their skepticism or otherwise about it, but also their attitudes to what their government, their university, their community is doing in response to climate change. And so we found here that students in Brazil were most likely to think the impact was bad. So here, a lower level represents a more concerned estimation of how bad the likely impacts of climate change will be. So in Brazil, most students thought that the effects of climate change would be very bad or extremely bad, where in Kenya, students were more optimistic, with Mozambique and Fiji in between. In terms of the causes, the impacts and the challenges, so why is it difficult, for example, to communicate or learn about climate change? There's a bit of variation here between the countries. And we see, for example, in Brazil, the answer most commonly given by students was that the issue is too political. And this is not surprising in relation to the recent turbulence in politics in Brazil, which has also revolved around questions of climate change versus climate denial. In Mozambique, Kenya, and Fiji, a little bit less of political concern and more evaluation of the problem being either too scientific or too complex. And in some cases, in Fiji, less of concern, where no challenges actually was the most common answer. So in Fiji, students seem to be more optimistic that it's possible to discuss, communicate, and address the challenges in their educations and in discourse more generally, where in Brazil it's considered a lot more controversial. There was much more consensus between students across the universities in terms of what they thought universities should be doing. So this normative question, and this perhaps is not surprising because it is influenced by global communications on climate change. Students across all the universities thought that that education should be a determining factor in combating climate change, that students should get involved in activities related to climate change at their universities. Universities should have community education initiatives that encourage action against climate change. And finally, that universities should be trusted spaces for discussion on climate change. And you might think, well, these are questions which is very easy to say yes to, because they're not being presented in a way that leads to any kind of trade-off or difficulties. But nonetheless, I was slightly surprised to see just how much agreement there is across countries on what universities should be doing. However, when we ask the question about to what extent students are satisfied with what their university is doing, there is a lot more variation. So this is, if you like, the more factual question. It's not the normative evaluation of what universities should be doing, but it is the judgment of what they actually are doing. So students were asked if they are learning enough about climate change, whether they're learning about it at all, or whether they're satisfied with that, or whether they are dissatisfied. So you can see across the 12 universities, there's quite a lot of variation. Most students said that they are learning about climate change to some extent, but at the same time, most said that they would like to learn more, or that they were not learning and would like to learn about it. So if you add together those two columns in the middle, you've got a large majority of students in most of those universities, actually, where some universities really, the students did not feel that they were learning anywhere near enough, and in others, they would still like to learn more. So the general pattern, even in the universities with the best results on this, if you like, the general pattern was that students would like to learn more and were not satisfied with what they were learning so far. Perhaps not surprising. There's a generational difference perhaps between the students' expectations about what they should be learning and what universities are equipped to teach. When we come then to the question of personal responsibility, students in general felt a high level of personal responsibility. So they were asked to evaluate their answer on a scale of 0 to 10, how much personal responsibility they felt to deal with the issues of climate change or mitigate climate change. Very high in all countries, but highest in Fiji and lowest in Brazil. And remember that we said earlier that Brazil was the country where there was the greatest concern about climate change, but here we see the lowest, just slightly, the lowest level of personal responsibility. We also asked students to distinguish between the likely effects of different kinds of effectiveness, different kinds of personal, collective, or government action in relation to climate change. So how likely is it that you yourself, your own personal action will affect climate change? How likely is it that collective action would affect climate change? And how likely is it that government action would affect climate change? So they're asked here how likely it is, not, what is the maximum potential? And we see here that in Brazil, for example, we get the lowest estimations of the likelihood of government action. And again, this is likely to be related to the recent political debates about climate change. The opposite result in Kenya to some extent, where students were much more positive about the likely effect of government action, and in Fiji too. Collective efficacy pretty high in all countries, but it's only slightly higher than personal efficacy, which might represent a slight misunderstanding or interpretation differences between the countries in these questions, because we would surely expect that collective action would be more successful than individual action, but we only see a slight difference here. We ask questions the extent to which they would be willing to participate in climate change activity, and there's various types of activity that were included in the question here. But across the board, we can see in general, there was a high willingness. And again, it was a question that is fairly easy to agree with, because it wasn't setting this against anything else. It wasn't making students make choices between climate change and activity and anything else. But nonetheless, in all the countries except Brazil, there was a very high willingness to participate. And just 2 universities in Brazil, to be fair, not all of them, showed a lower level of willingness, which is the University of Passo Fundo and the University of Sao Paulo. Now, I mentioned earlier that we wanted to link the attitudes that students have to climate change, the evaluations they have of their university's work in relation to climate change, to their general attitudes about the environment. So how concerned are they about the environment? Because this may lie behind many of their other beliefs. So we used a scale which has been used in a lot of studies already, the Milfont and Duckett scale, which has 12 dimensions. Now, in the full scale, there are a number of questions on each of these dimensions. We've used a reduced version to make this more manageable, with 24 questions, 2 on each of these dimensions. So the dimensions are enjoyment of nature, support of interventionist conservation policies, environmental movement activism, conservation motivated by anthropocentric concern, confidence in science and technology, environmental fragility, altering nature, personal conservation behavior, human dominance over nature, Eurocentric concern, support for population growth policies, and altering nature. Sorry, that's appeared twice. So you can see that these are all dimensions, not specifically of climate change, but of environmental attitudes much more generally. Now, in relation to these individual questions, just to show a rather technical graph here, but I think it's useful to understand that some of these questions are much more difficult to say yes to than others. So, for example, the most challenging question is a married couple should not have as many children as they wish. So this one relates to that scale on, the scale on support for population growth policies. And it's represented here by the brown line. So only the students with the highest level of environmental concern would say yes to the question, a married couple should not have as many children as they wish. A question which is much easier to say yes to is the yellow line here. The question, whenever possible, I try to save natural resources. Again, most people will say yes to that. Most people are on board with that, with the the intention to save natural resources wherever possible. And so this scale, and I've only included here a small number of examples of questions, but putting all these 24 questions together gives us an ability to then estimate students' level of environmental concern as a whole across that range of 12 dimensions. And then here we have how those patterns lie across the distribution of home assets as an example for the 4 countries. So how concerned are students about the environment set against their home assets? So their level of background advantage or disadvantage. So to the right of this graph here, we have the richest students in terms of their home backgrounds, and to the left, the poorest students. And then along that vertical axis, the level of environmental concern. And we can see that the poorest students here show lower levels of environmental concern, and the richer students show slightly higher levels. But actually, the biggest difference is really between the countries. And so the levels of environmental concern are significantly higher in Brazil than in the other 3 countries, regardless of the home assets here. So a student with the same level of home assets in Brazil is going to be more concerned about the environment than a student in the other 3 countries. We've put that into a regression analysis to try to understand what are some of the driving factors that lie behind environmental concern. And I won't read through the numbers, but just to highlight some of the variables which are correlated with higher levels of environmental concern when these control variables are included as well. So in terms of courses of study, students who are studying science, agriculture, or health and welfare related courses are more concerned about the environment. Those with higher levels of home assets, women students compared to men, and students in Brazil compared to the other 3 countries. And then when we do the same analysis separating by country, we get pretty similar patterns. So again, within the countries, doesn't matter which country it is, students who are studying science or health and welfare related courses are more concerned about the environment, those with higher levels of home assets. And again, women separately in all of those countries show more concern about the environment, and those who live in peri-urban areas compared to rural or urban areas. Putting all this together, we can see that there are some contradictions, some trade-offs, and some difficulties in explaining these patterns. So first of all, Brazil, as I said, has the highest levels of environmental concern, the strongest belief that humans are the cause of climate change, and the worst estimation of the impact of climate change, and a strong desire to learn more. Now, all of these could be seen as positive things in one sense, but at the same time, they may reflect what is in fact happening in Brazil or happening in their universities or the political climate. Because we also see that in Brazil, there is the lowest estimation of personal responsibility, and the probability of the impact of collective and government action is estimated lower in Brazil than in the other 3 countries. So that could be quite a negative and potentially depressing result. It also has the lowest willingness to act among students. We should remember, of course, that there are going to be cultural and linguistic differences between the countries, and the ways in which these questions are asked are not perfect and may not translate exactly across contexts, and may also pick up differences in cultural attitudes which we can't account for. So that should always be in the back of our minds. Nonetheless, relationships between beliefs and actions regarding climate change are mediated by political context in any country. And so that macro level perspective is something we need to have in the background, and it's not something we can easily ask about in this individual level student survey. So then our question, of course, for the project is, what are the implications of all these findings for universities? And hopefully that's something that we'll get to discuss, because they have to be interpreted at the individual level by universities. Back to that point about differences in cultural response, I just want to give 2 examples of questions that we asked, which got rather different sorts of responses in the countries, and might help us to understand the different ways in which the environment is understood, or in which students are evaluating policies and practices in relation to the environment. So here's one question which I mentioned earlier, or appeared in that graph earlier. Plants and animals exist primarily to be used by humans. So students were asked to give their agreement or disagreement with this statement. And you can see there's a big difference between the responses in Brazil. So students in Brazil thought that this was not the case. They strongly disagreed that the purpose of plants and animals is to be used by humans. Whereas in Kenya, there was much more ambivalence, and about half and half of the students either agreed or disagreed with this question. But we think this might reflect simply the ways in which people interact with plants and animals in different countries. So in a highly industrialized country, people don't come into contact so much with animals, and may have stronger views about it, which are possibly sustained by the fact that they aren't presented with trade-offs. They don't have to deal with livestock and so on. So that's a possible cultural difference. Same issue again here in relation to this second question. Lakes and rivers should be kept clean to protect the environment, not as places for people to enjoy water sports. Well, water sports is something that people enjoy in particular contexts, which are generally quite high income contexts. So we see there's a big difference again between Brazil and the other countries. If we compare Brazil and Kenya again, most students disagreed with the statement. So they felt that keeping the environment for the enjoyment of water sports was not the right thing to do, whereas in Kenya there was ambivalence. But again, people's experience of water sports is very different across these two countries, and we suspect it might be behind the ways in which students are answering. And because of that, we know that the environmental concern scale that we have developed here is a little bit sensitive to how these questions are asked in different countries. And the final one that we'll come to end on is the question, protecting the environment is more important than protecting jobs. Students were asked to disagree or agree with this statement, and we get quite a strong set of responses in Kenya. If we're comparing again, Fiji and Mozambique lie in between Kenya and Brazil here, but in Kenya, most students, a vast majority of students, thought that it was more important to protect the environment than to protect jobs. In Brazil, there was much more ambivalence. And again, maybe it's because there are many more people as a percentage in Brazil who are employed in formal jobs than in Kenya. So jobs may be something which directly affect people more in Brazil, but it may also be that there is this question about what's the relationship between the economy and the environment. And so it may be not seen in Kenya as a trade-off. It may be that this whole idea of opposing jobs and the environment is considered the wrong way to look at the question. And of course, it's making that assumption that if somehow there has to be a choice or a trade-off between the environment and jobs. Again, it's an important point in thinking about how to regard environmental protection and mitigation of climate change. So I'll end there and hand back over, I think, to Amanda, who is going to then pass us on to the next stage. And I'm ready to answer questions of clarification or any others on this. And I'll go back on the slides if we need to.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kane, for the brilliant presentation. And also thank you and Sarah for the great work with all that volume of data we had with this survey, and for presenting for us today. For the audience, please do share your views and comments into the chat. We are curious to know your thoughts on that topic, your experience in related works and experience with students, in involving them, in engaging them around climate change and environmental issues. So please feel free to share the comments there into the chat. And for questions to the panelists, please use the Q&A section. If you'd like to, we can invite you afterwards to ask the questions live here with us. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Elsa Holloway. Thank you for agreeing to participate with us today in this webinar. We very much look forward to hearing your views in response to Kane's presentation of this working paper. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. So first of all, Kane, thank you so much for your presentation, and huge congratulations to you and Tristan, and really this exemplary research collaboration for successfully conducting such a complex and difficult study, especially, and you actually didn't talk about this, it was undertaken in the middle of a pandemic as well, which made it, added multiple layers of complexity, and some would say it was a huge confounder, but you prevailed. So congratulations. Thank you for all of these insights that are highly salient for all of us who are kind of working in this climate change adaptation space and higher education. It's very meaningful. A lot of institutions are really keen to embrace it, and I think this is an excellent study that will help guide us. Now, I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have scope for conversation afterwards, but there were many insights for me from this study that really stimulated my thinking. And the first was the role of culture and context. And I think you talked about that: culture, context, rural, urban, inland, coastal, all these dimensions that would have influenced students' engagement. And from a higher education standpoint, kind of underline the need for really careful crafting of climate change education approaches, that maybe we can't simply adopt a cookie cutter approach, that it has to be contextually relevant. And in larger countries, it calls into question having a blanket approach. There needs to be nuance. It places a real onus of responsibility on the institution itself going forward. And then related to this, I was also struck by the mediating role of the different disciplines and fields and the way students engaged. And I was particularly struck by the findings in relation to the social sciences and humanities. And that kind of resonates with my own experience in the broader disaster risk and risk reduction domain in relation to climate and weather. And let me just share a tiny example from the kind of the climate science perspective, where we speak a great deal around the value of early warning, for instance, for severe weather, and strengthening our communications. And we work really hard to get that to communities. Sometimes the language used is that these are so-called end users. I don't particularly like that language, but that's how it's often portrayed. And what strikes me is that there has been very limited engagement with the social sciences that would actually harness the knowledges that they bring to strengthen understanding and engagement with the field. For instance, around the application of anthropology, for instance, which is a really important field for understanding how phenomena are understood and constructed, how we create our understandings. Also linguistics, for instance, also not engaged. And so I think that this highlights an interesting, that's not a contradiction, but a tension between the potential role the social sciences could undertake and the way it kind of is a bit narrow right now. And this link around the differentiation between the way we approach, or the way different fields and sciences approach the climate change discourse, leads me maybe into a slightly fringe area, but it's one that I've been really interested in, and that is the differentiation between weather and climate, and how that might affect students' perspectives. And I wonder sometimes whether some of the questions had been positioned from the perspective of weather, it would, the responses might have differed. Again, social science and service-oriented students might feel that climate, or the concept of climate and climate change, is a very science and sophisticated one, but they can engage with the lived experience of weather. And that is centrally relevant to the fields they're engaged with. And it is possible to stretch that concept of weather towards climate. So often it has been my experience that it's possible to probe the notion of climate through the lived experience of weather. It's just less intimidating. And the same applies to the disasters domain. I think that we talked about this before, where language around climate change mitigation in some countries might articulate with other language used in disaster preparedness. Evacuation, for instance, evacuation in severe weather events can be conceptualized both as a climate change adaptation approach, but it's also a disaster preparedness and response approach. And in countries with extensive experience in extreme weather or severe weather processes, they may have considered it to fall within the disasters domain. Just a couple of other observations. It's always easy to make these comments after the study is completed. I was really struck by the role that outreach plays in relation in the study, and its role in relation to strengthening research capacity, how it can build confidence in research. And I think this has a multi-scalar implication. It's not just about the individual students, but it is also about the way we position our learning opportunities as an enterprise in terms of the role as a university, as a socially responsive partner in climate change adaptations, where students really value that connection with the broader society. Those are just some thoughts. And I guess going forward, a question that really came to mind was, with all of this remarkable research and engagement, how does the team feel and think about proceeding at an institutional level with the broader climate change adaptation, learning and teaching, research and outreach processes into the future? So those were just some thoughts. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Amanda, and thank you so much, Kane. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elsa. It was great to hear your very interesting comments and reflections around this study. Before we move on to some of the questions we already have, Kane would like to maybe respond some of these reflections, or?
I think those are very useful points, actually drawing out some of the most important questions of implications for universities, but also putting it in a broader context, which was very helpful because Elsa works more directly in this area. And I think there are many things that we've drawn attention to that we can't fully explain here. And there are many other extraneous factors, as she mentioned, like the coronavirus. And, in some ways, the coronavirus pandemic actually reduced the damage being done in certain ways to the environment, but also helped students to think about what the relationship between the environment and their own studies were by, for example, going online, not traveling, etc. All these things were put into a new relief, but at the same time, I think the virus took precedence over lots of other issues because politics became about short-term solutions rather than long-term concerns. So I think this relates to a question that's been asked in the chat as well. What is the influence of political context? And it's extremely powerful. That's my feeling. We don't know the details. Our survey doesn't ask directly about that, but what's happening in the broader political environment is making a big difference to how students see these things. And Tristan shared with me yesterday a chart looking at concern about the climate emergency across different countries, with the UK being quite high at the top. And I wondered why, because the UK is not a country that is obviously affected in the same disastrous ways as many other countries are, but it has got quite a turbulent political situation, like Brazil had not so long back, where I think younger people particularly are reflecting on what their priorities are. And, these trade-offs between economic issues, environmental issues, and so on are high in the minds of young people in Britain, as they might have been in Brazil. So political context is very important. How universities respond to this, I think I totally agree with Elsa's point that it really needs to be tailored. You know, it would be very easy to do the wrong thing in a particular context by absorbing global messages and transmitting those in a way that wasn't sensitive to the real concerns that students have, and particularly in a context where their families may be working in very different contexts to the students themselves. So where students are coming from rural or peri-urban areas into universities in large urban centres, but their families live very different lifestyles, I think universities need to do a very careful job of not, as it were, presenting the story that really is relevant to students in a country like the UK, because, you know, here the messages are strongly about personal behaviour and reduction of impact on the environment, and students are largely on board with that. But at the same time, you know, the country is still a very significant emitter of carbon. It's still a very significant contributor to environmental degradation. That needs to be presented differently in different ways, not just for the students to absorb that in their behavior, but also to present a message which really, you know, is sensitive to their concerns. So I totally agree with that.
Thank you very much again. Maybe we can bring now some participants so that we have their participation with us. I will try to allow Delphine to ask a very nice question. I think you should be able to speak with us now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. So my question was, I'm teaching climate change in first grade to students in business school. And last week I was surprised because they bring this issue actually on economy and saying like we need to sustain economy. So how this compares with the fact and how we can address climate change. And so I talk about them about, you know, maybe we need to think differently about the economy and the degrowth of economy. And actually some of them are going to do research and a presentation on these things. And I brought some analysis already on this question on economy versus climate change. And so my question was, I was wondering in the analysis you did, if the type of students, the type of disciplines they are studying is taking into account. I wonder the impact, because this one was in business school, so very focused economy things. I imagine like if students studying science or maybe other area may have a different perspective. So yeah, curious about it. Thank you.
That's a really good question. And actually we don't have that answer, but we could easily calculate it. So I will definitely look at that. We've looked at the ways in which context affects students' behavior in relation to particular questions. So we know that, for example, in Brazil, students are more likely to give answers about the trade-off, more concerned about the trade-off, as I mentioned, but I just haven't done that analysis by discipline, and I could group the countries according to their disciplines and check that. So I will do that, and it'll be interesting to know the answer to that. There's a number of questions that come up that are behind that. So, for example, in all the countries, it is the case that certain disciplines will be more prestigious and more difficult to get into. So studying medicine, for example, is going to require higher grades. So the students are not the same, of course, in every discipline. So not only you might have the more able students or those having higher school scores in medicine and science, but you might also have those who are more advantaged because, again, in some countries, the fees for studying medicine or science may be higher. So those two things we need to remember. The students are not the same, but we can control for their backgrounds in terms of the economic aspects. What we don't have is any information on their school grades. So we're not able to say in any of the countries which students are the higher performing students, you know, who might have been able to pass the entry requirements into science and medicine. My suspicion is, I mean, we know that students studying some disciplines, even when controlling for other aspects are more concerned about the environment in general, but I just haven't got the answer to that specific question about the trade-off. But my feeling is that students in science will be more in favor of prioritizing the environment over jobs. And if I can check that by the end of this webinar, I'll give you the answer. But then again, even if that is the case, what the reason is, whether it's their ability, whether it's their background, whether it's their assets, but also another possibility, I think, is that students who are studying science type subjects may be predisposed to see these questions in a slightly more objective and slightly less contested way. So students who study humanities and social sciences might be inculcated to see both sides of an argument a little bit more. I don't know what you think about that. Do you have time to just give a brief response?
Delphine?
Delphine?
Yeah, sorry, I was not sure the question was for me. I feel this super interesting because even on the grade, I was wondering, if this may influence in the way like maybe they are too young. But then I think about all the protests of the young students I work with, and it's not about the age. But I may feel like there may be some influence because, of course, in this class, it's more like people from rich family. This includes a lot of international students. So I can see also most of the students who come from abroad are more interesting and focused on the topic than the other one. So this is interesting for me as well. And I only teach for this type of students, so I don't know about the other one. But yeah, I guess I'm sure students from another discipline will have another view. But then, we took the opposite, like for instance, economy and science, but you were talking about medicine and other type of students. And yeah, I wonder, it's really interesting. I think like having some analysis on that may help because, when I teach, I also reflect, how to shake them sometimes and what type of information to bring because they are like doing business, they talk about. So I try to influence the teaching as well to address their interest, which may not be the same if you teach in another area when students may be more concerned, for instance, on a scientific issue. So super interesting. Thanks for all your inputs. It's make me reflect a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. And I suppose your students, if they're coming in with an interest in economics and the business and they want to be entrepreneurs, especially, they might be concerned about potential brakes being put on their entrepreneurship. But equally, I'm sure you get a chance to talk about the green economy, which in some countries is actually a whole new area of entrepreneurship. So, I mean, there's just no clear answer to these questions, is there? And it depends very much on what the opportunities are.
Yeah, and they are, I think for them, they are so much topic to discuss because company and industry are so much responsible also on the impact and can really have a change. So to bring this topic on the table and discuss how business can interact and engage and take responsibility, they are huge of place for that. But I was very surprised because I taught last year and no one brings this question of economy, sustainable economy. And I was very surprised, like it was a strong discussion and a debate in the class. And at some points, I feel like maybe this is more important. It was not all of them, it was some of them, but bringing this, like we need to sustain economy because if we don't sustain economy, nothing will happen. And so, it was interesting. It was interesting, but for sure what you said on bringing all the green economy and all these things, like how companies as well use climate change for their own communication and not doing those things properly. So, and all the impact on Brazil. And there are plenty of topics to talk even on climate justice. But yeah, I was surprised with this kind of perspectives I brought last time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Delphine. Now, I would like to invite Luis Alipio to share his question with us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. So first of all, my name is Luis Alipio. I'm from the Amazon in Brazil. And I just would like to congratulate Kanye, Rolling Stones, and the others for the research. It's a pleasure to know about the data about our reality in climate change, considering the data you bring. So I would like to ask you about the political influence in the response of the research, because there was a mean of 4.17 about the government action in Brazil. And you answered me. You answered this question because during the research, it was in another period, in another context. There was a government, and now I think that this mean should be different, because the political context changed. But I have another consideration about what we are discussing. Sometimes we usually ask about the role of the university. Sometimes we are asking about what the university should do. And I was thinking about the structure of the university. For example, it is highly specialized in nature. The university, sometimes they are very specialized in nature, usually in a single disciplinary or professional area. Teachers, professors in higher education are usually researchers and scholars in a disciplinary area, and they rarely have extensive pedagogical preparation. So how can we face with these barriers? I need to tell you that this is it's a paragraph, a short paragraph that I read from the Climate2 publication, because here I think that we have an important point to discuss. How can we first change the university to approach about climate change? That is the question. Thanks a lot, and congratulations again.
Thank you very much, Luis. Amanda, do you mind if I ask you to say something? Because, I mean, I think your knowledge of politics in Brazil is way better than mine.
Sure, yeah, I can start. I think this comment is really relevant. I would also expect the mean to change if we reassess that aspect now, with the different scenario in terms of politics, and this could be an additional study in our context here in Brazil and in the other countries also, if relevant. Although this result could be better in terms of hope from the students, we would also continue to work with the universities, because the students' views, their expectation, their confidence in the government is one thing, and it is important, but it is somehow can be somehow disconnected from the student initiative on campus and their engagement in class with the opportunities that are out there. Maybe with this higher confidence in the government, they can be more relaxed in terms of their own role for action, and I'm not sure how this could be, how this will work in practice. Maybe I could already comment on one aspect that I took notes here. It was interesting to see that in Brazil, for example, and in our university, we had this low willingness from students engaging with climate change initiatives. And we see that every day. We see that also in our PAR initiative there. And we saw also the fact that students tend to be super sad, hopeless, because they think that their action won't be enough, considering the university context and the national context, or they tend to be a bit angry with the situation and focusing on small actions in their personal lives. So I think the university could use this moment, this change now, and offer more moments for reflection in terms of, okay, we have a new context, a new scenario. How can we change? How can we take advantage of that? And I mentioned this thinking of our university, of the whole Brazilian scenario, but I think it's important for all universities that were part of this study. This aspect of the political aspect and the role of the university in addressing this issue, I think it would be interesting to hear about not only your insights, Ken, but also Dr. Elsa, who can add some thoughts here for us.
Yeah, let's go to Elsa, because I think I've given my sort of comments on this one, and I'm sure others have something to add.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think context, as the study underlines, context really informs this and other aspects of climate change adaptation work. I also want to just take up the finding around the cultural difference, and to a certain extent that has a political overtone as well. I think, and I stand under correction, that both in Fiji and in Kenya there was greater confidence in collective action. Is that correct? And clearly that would resonate possibly with the cultural environment and the way people respond to shocks and stresses on a regular basis. So even the role of the university is going to shift depending on the political context. Is it viewed as a partner in this enterprise, or is it viewed as a more combative or adversarial player in the process? I think that's also really important as well. It's important for universities to choose how they situate themselves in relation to government and other processes, and in relation to government positions on this, and the degree to which government supports and enables institutions of higher learning to make the kind of shifts and changes that Luis has mentioned. That if you want to start unlocking scope for more cross-disciplinary and integrated work, that may require support to do that. You know, it's shifting and it's institutional change. That's going to require thinking, adjustment, and maybe maybe support at higher or different levels. So yes, the interface even between the higher education enterprise and the political environment is really important if you want to shift and you want to make substantial shifts in an environment that requires funding support and other enablements from your broader political environment.
Yes,
That's
great.
Yeah.
Can I just say something very brief? I mean, it seems to me that students, like the general public, don't have objective kind of answers or access to, as it were, uncontested facts about climate change. I mean, it's a huge sea of information they have to wade through. And so the environment in terms of what the government is saying, or what initiatives are being launched, what the debates are that they're surrounded by in the media and in their universities and so on, are really going to influence how they interpret that evidence, because it's just not something that you can do by yourself at home, right? So, the general level of optimism in the climate, if you're in a context, which I believe Fiji is a little bit more like this, where things are happening, you can see people taking actions that are intended to mitigate the effects of climate change. You might be much more likely to be part of one of those things yourself. You're also in a relatively small context where these things are more visible. I just think that's going to have an effect on how you perceive the whole set of problems. Whilst in reality, of course, these are global issues, and what Fiji is doing is only a tiny drop in the ocean, but what you can see is going to be really important.
Yes, these are all very relevant points. Thank you very much. I want to check if Gianna would like to join us and ask her question live as well. I will allow you to ask in case you are able to.
Yes, thank you. Hi, just thank you for sharing this study. I was thinking in two questions, in fact. One was, since Brazil is a huge country, I didn't notice if there was a difference in the sample, like students from more rural universities or more related to regional versus urban universities, and if there's different results, and also if this project is willing to continue and do these comparisons in a further survey. Yeah, that's my question, and thank you so much, Kane, and everyone.
Thank you very much for the question. Kane, would you like
was
to
that the question? Sorry, I'm just getting mixed up reading the question and listening to it, but it was the same question, wasn't it, about the differences between contexts in Brazil? And yes, we have got that information, but I haven't actually presented it. So I will check that as well to know whether or not the differences in attitudes, for example, were very significantly different between the universities in Brazil.
Oh, thank you. Because, yeah, I mean, perhaps as the other participant in this chat that comes from an Amazonian university may have different concerns and different point of view than students that lives in Sao Paulo with a completely different context. And the other question was if this research will continue, if you are intended to do another survey in the future.
Well, that one would be great if we had support for that. I mean, at the moment, I think we run out of funds in this October, so that's the current end date. But of course, there's always more opportunity to bid for further funds and to, if we are successful in that, to continue the work. So I hope so. I can just answer, Amanda, as well, very briefly, the question now, because I just checked in the data which courses of study students are most likely to be concerned about that trade-off between jobs and the environment. So those who were most concerned about it were students in agriculture and health and services. And those who were least concerned were students in humanities, education, and engineering. So, I mean, the differences aren't huge, but I think it's interesting and relates to what Elsa said, particularly in a subject like agriculture. It would be strange, wouldn't it, to see the two things as totally opposed, right? They must naturally come together in a subject like agriculture. So that's what the results are showing.
Thank you very much, Ken, and also Jenna for the question. I am from University of Passo Fundo in the very south of Brazil, and maybe we can have some colleagues from the Amazon to comment on your question as well, but we assessed the differences between universities. We noticed the difference in the profiles of students. You are also invited to check that in the graphs, in the text, of course, of the working paper. And the main point that I would highlight as a difference in Brazil was the willingness to engage in climate change initiatives. It was a bit higher for the university in the Amazon, Federal University of Pará, in comparison to University of São Paulo and our university in the south.
Oh, okay.
I would like to invite us all to reflect on the way forward with the project and the use of these survey results, because we see the importance of this information, but what we'll do with all that? Ken, do you have any expectation in terms of how each university should proceed in terms of working with this data and applying the findings from it?
I mean, I think that's where we need to go back to the question of what are the concerns and the policy issues in relation to a particular context. So, I mean, we have the data, which is effectively asking the same questions in all the contexts, but what is of interest really does differ from one place to another. So I'm just looking at that question about attitudes in different universities in Brazil. And it looks like actually, again, it's slightly, maybe it's not strange, but it's not what I would immediately expect. Students in the urban contexts are expressing the highest levels of concern about climate change. And again, that question of whether or not they feel that nothing is being done about it is more important than whether they feel that they will be affected. We haven't got that level of granularity in terms of those questions. But again, it may well be, and Luis would know much better, that if you're in the Amazon, you actually have a slightly more optimistic attitude towards, what might happen as a result of climate change, even though the story that's presented on the news or in the urban areas would be that it was calamitous. I mean, it's really a tricky kind of thing to get right, isn't it? And that's where I think that the researchers in the countries that are really on the ground and much closer to the context ought to work together to think about what the questions that can really be answered with this data are in those contexts. And because on its own, it won't answer them. You really need to use this data in relation to the evidence that you have from other sources to give it some meaningful interpretation. So I'd be happy to work with you to think about that. And if you have other sources of data, and I think you do sometimes from the PAR groups and so on, you have qualitative data as well. Did Tristan want to comment on that?
Yes, I think, yeah.
Actually, I was going to ask another question, which it's linked with the rural urban, but it's about income, poverty, wealth, and so forth. And This is an interesting question generally in relation to the environment, because I think in most countries we've seen this historical shift from environmental concerns being, at least in terms of campaigns, starting out as quite an elite thing, and being the concern of people who have aristocratic concerns around hunting and so forth, and natural areas for their own enjoyment, towards becoming more of an urban middle class issue with a sort of a notion of nature, a sort of idealized notion of nature and wildlife, to one that in more recent years has become more closely linked with social movements for equality, social justice and so forth, because environmental issues are now somewhat closely linked to the immediate survival and well-being of the forest communities in the world. And given that backdrop, what do our survey findings say about the link between wealth and poverty and some of these issues around concerns, and whether that's really what we would expect? I suppose there are maybe factors on both sides. On the one hand, poorer communities may already feel the impacts in terms of weather and some other factors, but they may have lower levels of I mean, presumably they're all university students, so they've got the same amount of formal education, but they might have less access to information and so forth. So any reflections on this question?
Is that, Tristan, to anyone specific?
Well, I suppose maybe to you, just in terms of what we found in our survey, but open to Elsa and Amanda and anyone else who might like to comment from their perspectives. And I suppose our other colleagues who are on the call who were involved in the survey are also very welcome to comment from the Kenyan and Fijian perspectives.
That would be interesting, because I think it's ambiguous. I think that the survey data is ambiguous in risk because you've got this crossover between, let's say we don't have agriculture as a discipline equally in every university, and so we don't have law equally in every university. So we can't make these direct comparisons to be able to say, that one is the cause of the other. We don't have as many urban students in Kenya as we do in Brazil and so on. So I think we can't iron out these questions with great specificity, but what we can do is try to understand that a little bit more in context. I think the limit of the international comparisons comes quite quickly unless you've got an absolutely enormous sample. Even then, the questions just do mean slightly different things in different contexts. And so, I mean, even in Brazil, if you're asking this sort of question about trade-offs to students in the Amazon compared to those in Sao Paulo, I'm sure they're going to see it differently.
But I think our assets index in relation to environmental concern showed that wealthier students were slightly more concerned about climate change. Is that right?
Oh yes, but that could be due to the fact that the questions that comprise the scale on environmental concern are possibly rather Western urban biased. That's the problem, because to develop a set of questions that would really relate to the trade-offs that people have in rural areas or in the Amazon would be a different exercise.
Thanks.
Dr. Elsa, any thoughts like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kane and Tristan, you've already raised some of the issues, and it was something that I thought about as I was reading the study, and certainly those I guess a couple of thoughts. Those students whose histories, whose families, whose worldviews are informed by primarily rural or rain-fed agriculture style livelihood are going to and particularly those who have been exposed to periods of drought punctuated by sudden onset rainfall will have already had a history of this as part of their lived experience. It's kind of difficult to differentiate it. They are already they're already living in situations of precarity while those in urban areas have the benefit of infrastructure and government services to mediate those kinds of effects. And so the lived experience is much more direct. And I think differentiating that from a changing climate in the future is pretty challenging. So context to context is going to be quite difficult. And our colleagues in Mozambique, of course, will again have the lived experience of decades of extreme weather conditions, vacillating between extreme drought and extreme rainfall. Whereas in other countries, those kinds of extremes or the consequences of those kinds of extremes are only starting to become more evident now. So yeah, context to context is going to be really important in analysis. And of course, that will shape how universities will engage. You know, the development context where an institution is located is going to inform the kinds of programs, the kinds of research opportunities that are going to be available.
And it seems, I think the precarity point you made is very important, because there's a strong link between precarity and also harmony, because, you know, those that are living in greater harmony with the environment may actually be affected by more precarious circumstances. Those that are, you know, way away from that in an urban area experience neither. But that may mean that they're actually more concerned about impending dooms of some unknown kind of force that, you know, is much more demonic to them.
Yeah, I would agree that in some ways it's an ongoing debate around what really is vulnerability. Essentially, is vulnerability kind of or precarity something that is visualized from outside, or is there an adaptive capacity that has been built over decades, if you like? That's not an excuse, and it's not a reason to keep things as they are in terms of developmental aspirations. But there are strategies to accommodate that, and that's not just limited to technical strategies. There are collective strategies, there are cultural responses that allow a process of managing those kinds of extremes. So and in the global north, we have, especially in urban areas, there are a range of services that kick into play to predict, to warn, to take action in advance of let's say extreme weather. I'm reminded most staggeringly of my own personal disbelief in the event of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, which is a well-resourced country with all the scientific and forecasting capabilities, but with very minor, with limited adaptive capacity in that particular context. And something like close to 2,000 people lost their lives. In 2000, the Mozambican floods claimed 800. Mozambique was emerging from a civil war. You know, different capabilities, different perceptions. I digress, but it's a complex landscape, I think.
That was a really good example because it was just bewildering, wasn't it, at the time? It was bewildering.
Staggering, and I always think of it in terms of the extraordinary situation that Mozambique had experienced just a couple of years before, and there was a collective response. It's never optimal, of course, but the country, with the help of its neighbors, responded. And in countries where there is a recurrent history of exposure to threats, or with extreme threats, there is a kind of capacity there that kind of we forget in more developed context. So it's a digression, but it's also a resource to harness, as Climate U is doing with your participatory research.
That's really complex, and certainly demands more research and action and investigations around these issues, so that we can try to change that in the higher education sector and in the others as well. As our time is up, I think we had one more question. I think we can respond to it by email. It was regarding other barriers to approach climate change in higher education. This aspect was also covered in previous working papers and webinars, so we can talk more about that in the future as well. I would like to thank you, thanks Kane and Dr. Elsa for the participation today in our webinar, for your great presentations, insights, comments. All of that is extremely important in our way forward in each university, part of the Climate U project, but also in terms of contributions for the higher education practice and literature as well. I'd like to thank also our audience for the comments, for the questions. We hope you enjoyed this time with us. Kane and Elsa, any final comments for the audience?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And the study, is it online yet? What is the plan for gaining access? Because, you know, I'm based in Auckland. We just had a really severe weather event and another cyclone on its way. So there's a great deal of interest in higher education for taking forward some of the kinds of topics that are reflected in the study. What happens next?
That's a good question. So it went live yesterday, I think, the full report on this survey. So you can see that now. And you've seen a much earlier version. So it's been cleaned up and it looks a lot better. The graphs are a lot easier to read, which is a big improvement. But it's a huge document. So you know, if you're interested, it'll take a bit of time to wade through, but there are individual presentations for each of the countries in there. I think that there's a lot more data than we were able to present. And I believe, and Tristan will be able to clarify this, that the data itself will be available as well, ultimately, for those who want to use it. So that's the public aspect of it is very important for this kind of funded project. And the aim would be to make that available and to have it used widely. And then to be able to link it to some of the other studies that have taken place, the participatory action research and so on. But maybe, Tristan, do you want to say something about the next step? Unfortunately, I have another 10:30 meeting, so I'm going to have to go now.
Thanks. Yeah, well, we have had our allotted time, but yeah, the data will all be available via the UK data service. The tool is available on our website as Working Paper 7, which you can see, and the full reports is also just being published as Working Paper 10. Please do have a look at it. There will also be, I mean, one thing we haven't managed to do yet is to do the close-up contextualized interpretation and analysis for each country and region and institution. Some of the questions we had today were relating to that. Those will be emerging over the coming months and over the next year. Our teams are working on those as well. And anyone else who's in the audience who's interested in this or perhaps carrying out the survey, same survey or a similar survey in their own context, please do use the tool, get in touch, discuss it with us. We're very much welcome. So thank you very much from me for Amanda for her fantastic chairing of the event. And for everyone else for participating. We hope you'll be involved in future Climate U events. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Tristan and Amanda.
Thank you, Elsa, for your contributions.
Yeah.